Back. Oh man. So here's the awesome thing about what I love about running narrative and being able to host this is I get to be introduced, and Tiffany, I believe, is the one that introduced us. Is that correct, Mike? I think.
Yes.
Yeah. Yeah. I just brain fart right there for a second because I couldn't quite remember how we were introduced. But that's what is so exciting is that I get people that introduce other great people, and typically, especially as we're doing and interviewing individuals, there's always somebody that somebody else knows. So I want to take the moment at the very beginning of this to say, yes, we love introductions and love being able to have other people come on the show that maybe you guys are listening to or heard. Please feel free to introduce them to me, to the show, and we absolutely love that. But on to you, Mike, man. Thank you for taking the time. I know we actually spent now almost 30 or no 15 minutes in the green room talking, and I think we probably could have spent another hour
Yeah.
just talking about some awesome stuff. But I'm excited for this. I'm really excited because I in that conversation we had a chance to kind of start to dive a little bit deeper, and I know this is going to be a really cool conversation storyline. But let's get started with this. So thanks for being here. But we just meet. Give me a 30-second, 90-second. Who is Mike?
Sure. Well, everybody generally identifies themselves by what they do. I think it's more important if we're being intentional to identify ourselves by who we are. So I'm first and foremost, I'm a follower of Christ. I'm a husband of 21 years. I'm a dad of two teenage daughters. So please pray for me. Beautiful, amazing girls, and there's not enough ammunition in the world to protect them, right? And I'm a weirdo. I don't fit like everybody else does. And the funny thing about it is, in the 24 years I've been in practice and the thousands of people I've talked to, everybody feels like a weirdo who doesn't fit. So we're actually all the same, which is funny. And no matter how much our society would like to tell us we're all different and divide us, everybody's the same. We all want the same thing. We all want to have good relationships. We do want to do meaningful work. We want to be able to pay our bills, have a slice of pizza, go have some fun, and take our kids to the movies if we want to. Everything else is window dressing that's just trying to divide us. So I think it's important to keep that in mind.
Oh, I love that. I love that concept too. And you're absolutely right. Especially the core of narrative is to really get to the individuality. But at the same time, every time we dive into somebody's individuality, it's amazing how similar they are in the storylines. And maybe it's a little bit slightly different as far as like you said, the window dressing. I'm probably going to use that. I love that aspect. It's slightly different in the window dressing, but the core elements are always the same. And that is the core of narrative and where we're going. So, all right, let's start with what you thought your life was going to be like prior to adulthood, prior to actually entering into the life that you now live. What did you think was going to happen? What were the beliefs or the formations that created your actions before you stepped into your adult life?
Sure, that's a great question, Tim. And the funny thing is that I had no idea. I grew up I'm a kid of the 70s and 80s because I'm an old fart. And I grew up with this perspective that, well, you're supposed to know what you're supposed to do, you're going to be this, and that your whole life is aimed towards that goal. 30 years in a gold watch, or you're going to be a doctor or a fireman or a policeman or whatever. I had no clue. And growing up in a fairly dysfunctional family with alcoholism and abandonment and some kinds of abuse, I grew up a kid that lived in fear, believing I couldn't trust anybody, who grew up with some shame because I was a victim of sexual molestation, and grew up basically learning how to survive on my own, and had some super awesome friends growing up in high school. But when I finished high school, my dad was, I grew up in Westchester County, New York. My dad was in Manhattan with my stepmom, and my mom and my stepdad moved to West Palm Beach. So the home I grew up in, I graduated high school, that home was gone. So I went after that summer, I went to college, and that kind of formative thing that you're asking about for me was, I think you had talked about what's that one thing that made a huge difference in your life, and I think I can't really nail down one particular thing. I mean, leaving where I grew up in New York and moving down to Jacksonville to go to school, that was one, right? And that was like, okay, I don't really have a home to go back to anymore. So it's kind of on me now. I've got to figure stuff out. And I remember this moment when I was working a summer between college years, and I was living down at my mom's house for a period of time, where I was looking at this tendency I had to kind of feel sorry for myself and feel like a victim, and that just rubbed me the wrong way. And I think I was 18 or 19 at the time, and I just said to myself, Mike, you can't blame your parents anymore. You can't blame your past anymore. The decisions that you're an adult, and the decisions you make moving forward are on you. So I'm 55 now, and I still don't know who I want to be when I grow up, but I'm figuring it out.
Yeah, you just unloaded a bunch of stuff that I want to dive into. So
Sure.
if with your permission, I kind of want to jump into this because I think there's a lot of things here that in that short 2 minutes or so that we were talking, I made some notes here. One of them was the fact that you said you learned to survive, but yet you were living in shame and fear.
Right.
And so in that part of it, that especially as I've talked to many different individuals, that forms the way we live and the way that we proceed to uh, see our lives and how they're actually going to play out. What was the impact of thinking that, hey, I am shameful for the things that happened? Because obviously, well, I shouldn't say obviously, assumingly that you felt that it was your fault that things happened to you, and that's where the shame comes from, and the fear
Right.
is like it's going to happen again. So how did that impact the belief of way life was going to be? What was going through your brain in that aspect, and does it still affect you today?
Well, yeah, where that led to was an early part of my life living in fear. I kind of, when I was in high school, I thought of myself as Mike and Michael, and Mike was the guy I wanted to be, confident, fun loving, smart, able to do whatever he puts his mind to, and Michael was this angry, hurting, fear filled person who didn't believe anything was going to work out. So it was this kind of at war in myself all the time, and I didn't know God then. So that, can you imagine anybody that doesn't really have faith and have the power of faith, trying to figure everything out on your own? No matter how smart you are, you fail,
Mm.
right? So the trajectory that took me on, I went to college. I did well in college, and then I got out of college, and I had a not super useful bachelor's degree, and so I worked, and then I went back to college 9 years later, and I got my master's degree, and the rest is history. And but that it's funny. You your podcast, you have, my narrative was X, and you're talking about the commonality of some of the things that I've expressed here, and I was like, geez, what am I going to tell Tim? Is what's my narrative? Because you've got so many people saying the same thing. My narrative was I'm worthless, and I think for me that's definitely part of it, was the shame stuff. And I think the biggest one, though, really was that I wasn't safe. And it took me really intentionally seeking a relationship with God in the context of my marriage to my wife, and thank God for her, to really start to realize, okay, maybe God's not like my dad, not like my grandfather, not like my parents, not like other people. Maybe I can actually trust him,
Mm.
and maybe I can be safe.
Well, that is such a profound concept right there, is the fact that we live lives in unstable worlds. And yes, there are abusive situations that happen, everything from the sexual side to mental, physical, verbal, all of those things come in, which creates an unsafe environment. And especially as a child growing up, if that's all we know, that's what we believe the rest of the world is. And we
Correct.
don't see the safety that could potentially come in a good relationship. I don't want to belabor that point because there's two other things in here that that you mentioned. One of them was the fact that you created a belief when you moved to Jackson, like, hey, now it's on me.
Right.
Was that an acceptance of all responsibility, or what maybe walk us through that? Because I know that there's people that have done that before, where it's like all of a sudden, if it's going to be, it's up to me, and that's a prevailing American theme of pulling ourselves up by our bootstraps, which is contrary to the way that we should be living, which is we are part of a community. We should be helping each
Right.
other.
Well, I think, Tim, that came from two things. One was not wanting to trust people because of being hurt, and the other one was that I think the way that God made me is I'm kind of ornery, and I really can't stomach the idea of thinking of myself as a victim.
Mm-hmm.
That I'm okay, if it needs to be done, I'm going to figure out a way to do it. And when my dad left, I was 15. It was just my mom and I. My sister was in college, and we had some pretty cold winters. We had a wood burning stove, so I had to figure out firewood. So I split a lot of logs and stacked a lot of firewood and operated a chainsaw quite a bit, until I got out of New York and came to Florida, because it had to be done. And what I noticed in myself was this tendency to be resentful or to feel sorry for myself, and that's just, I think that rubbed up against the way God actually made me to be, which is to be a victor or a champion, not to be a victim, as we see writ large in our society today. So when I talk to folks who come into my office who had something bad happen to them, I say, well, okay, yeah, that happened to you. Yeah, that had an impact, but does that define who you are today? And I don't think so. I think that God defines who we are today. So that's where that. So yeah, I struggled to trust other people and put an undue amount of pressure on myself, and beat myself up for every mistake and failure, because that was what I learned to do when I was young. And I just really wanted to punch the idea of being a victim in the face. So it was kind of both of those things.
Yeah, no, and I couldn't agree more with you, because our John Elridge wrote a book, A Wild at Heart,
Love it.
which really, really speaks to the core of what a man wants to do, and the adventure and the fact of being able to save the maiden. And I resonate with that too.
Yep.
I hear you when you're talking like that. And I'm like, yeah, that's right, exactly. Like, we are really, truly born to be warriors and to fight, and that's our true nature. That's really where that's at. So I think that's what you're alluding to.
Yep.
Yeah, awesome. All right, so let's go ahead and step into this next part of where we are at in this journey. There's a lot of beliefs that were formed that you created. What was the situation that, or maybe like you mentioned, it was like one was a move to Jackson, one was the marriage, one was like you had several things that did happen. But what was the catalyst that started this journey of looking at the world from a different perspective and changing the worldview that you had into where you're at today?
Well, one I'll attribute to a professor when I was in my master's program, and she said, Mike, you need to practice liking people. And I was like, internally, I was like, what are you talking about? People stink. I can't trust people. But she was right. I walked around with this giant chip on my shoulder and shields up all the time. And when I opened myself up to that concept of, okay, maybe I should practice liking people, the weirdest stuff started happening. Like, people would just randomly start talking to me, and I was like, I have a sign on my shirt or something on my forehead saying, I'm a safe person to talk to. So it's funny. I started putting out a different vibe to people. So that was part of it. That was the recognition that once I take the chip off my shoulder, people are actually nice. And if you're nice to people, you get nice back 99.9% of the time, really. And the second one is much, much larger than that. And that was meeting my wife. And then when we started thinking about having kids, we're like, okay, we want better for our children. So we need to get connected with the church. And we started going to my local church here. And that started me down the journey of getting to know God. And I think a third one, if I can say it, is I grew up with the Jesus walking with the little kids around his ankles and a baby lamb over his shoulder, nice Jesus. And when I really got a grasp of the story of Jesus going into the temple and fashioning a whip and flipping over tables, I was like, wait a minute, Jesus is a warrior. Jesus isn't a wuss. I can get behind this guy, because I'm like, wait a minute, that resonated with me. Like John Eldridge talking about having a ceremony around a fire and getting a sword and all this other stuff. I'm like, yeah, I want to be that. And so before that, I thought Jesus was nice, kind of wimpy. I don't know if I can follow that guy, but I'm like, no, he's not. He's a truth speaker, and he's a warrior, and he is love, and he is grace. He's all of those things that I think we all want to be.
So how did your mentality shift then? What were the main things that you noticed? Like, hey, I've got to It sounded like one of them was, I need to like people. It sounded like
Yeah.
that was one of the major shifts. And I love that concept because of the fact that there is something to the energy that we put out that we get back. If we put out negative energy, we're going to get it back. Put out positive energy, we get that back. So that's definitely, were some other things that you were like mentally, I have to think this way, or I have to change my verbiage, or I have to talk a specific, what were some of those if you could define that?
Well, you mentioned John Eldridge's book "Wild at Heart" in regards to that resonating with the warrior spirit. One of the things that really stuck out to me about that book was where he talks about how the enemy works, and I fleshed that out in my book, which is about helping people overcome shame. About how the enemy is an intruder; he's like a sniper that attacks from cover. In that, when a sin thought, a temptation goes into your brain, it is just a temptation that doesn't actually belong to you. That it feels like it's you, right? It's that memory, it's that thought, it's that whatever that comes into your head. But if you can recognize, like, wait a minute, this is an unwanted thing, it's an intruder, then you no longer have to take responsibility for that. It's kind of like what Paul talks about in Romans 7, one of my favorite passages, the do verse. The good I wish to do, I do not do, but the evil I do not wish to do, this I keep on doing. And ultimately capping it off with, what a wretched I am, and thanks be to Jesus Christ who delivers me from this because of sin in us. So what resonated with me is I wanted to be a man of the fruits of the Spirit. I wanted to be a man that my wife could trust, that my wife could look up to, that she could feel safe being led by, and that I had the humility to allow her to lead me where I was weak. That I wanted to be gentle and kind and have self-control and not give in to anger. So it's conviction is what we're talking about, Tim, is that I felt convicted by the messages that I was receiving, sometimes in a rather uncomfortable fashion. But I wanted to be better.
Hmm.
If I can encapsulate that, I wanted to be a better man for my wife and for my kids.
So how
And
did
for
your, go ahead.
Go ahead. No, go ahead.
I was gonna say, so how did meeting your wife make that shift, or what role did she play in? And we actually, it's interesting because as I do talk and do the interviews, it may not be somebody's wife or husband or spouse. It may be somebody on the outside, but there's always that one individual that speaks kindness, shows kindness, exemplifies a different way of living that triggers something in our brains. And I'm curious if that is the case with your wife. How did your wife impact your thoughts, your perspective? How did she amplify that change? Would be maybe the right word, but just how did she create that different perspective?
And my wife is probably the best person I know, hands down, because she always, without fail, thinks the best of every person she meets. And so you have this juxtaposition, this sort of conflict of me with my walls up, suspicious, think the worst of situations and people at times, perspective with hers. Well, maybe they didn't mean it that way. Maybe they were having a bad day. So she is grace exemplified, right? And of course, she's not perfect. She has her grouchy days, but overarching, she's just amazing, right? So I can always rely on her because growing up with not the greatest moral compass in my own family of origin, if I'm having a situation, I talk with her about it. She always lands the plane. Like when I lost my job, I had a corporate job. We were going to be laid off. I got a good notice and I had a nice severance from it. But I'm running around with my head count, what are we going to do? Because I was scared to trust God and go full time private practice. And of course, God's like, come on, Mike, But I said to her, like, well, what if it doesn't work out? And she's like, you can get a job. I'm like, oh yeah. And so she simplifies things for me, and so that's a huge thing. Is she's just this constant positive influence of, well, maybe there's a nicer way to look at it. And I'm like, you're a better therapist than I am,
Well, I'm giving you the chance to brag on your wife, and I love what you're doing. But is there anything else you want to add? Because this way, it's recorded for posterity and on and on.
Well, it also the other good folks in my life, the messages from my church and getting involved in a men's accountability group, that was a really freeing thing for me, Tim, because not having my dad around in my formative years as a teenager, I didn't really know how. I wanted to be an honorable man. I wanted to be a good man, but I didn't know how, right?
Yeah.
So starting with a men's accountability group 15 plus years ago and going in there and saying, okay, kind of like, I'm having a problem with my wife, and all the guys going, oh, yeah, me too. I'm like, wait a minute. Like, I'm not the only dude who's dealing with this. I'm not the only guy who gets mad at his kids or gets frustrated with his wife or, slacks off at work sometimes. And the commonality of the struggle is rampant. I mean, if you actually are courageous enough to say, hey, I'm struggling with X thing with people you trust, you're going to get a healthy me too. So that my wife, obviously God, and then having other good godly men around me who wanted to go in the same direction, it basically just gave me permission to be imperfect.
Mm. I love that comment that you just made, the commonality of the struggle. I mean, that's another really great point that you're bringing out is we all struggle. And oftentimes that's why we've done this narrative and look at that just to let everybody else know that you're not alone going through that struggle. So beautifully said, beautifully said. So looking at it, what do you do now to write your narrative? What are the practices? Maybe we look at the habits or routines that you've put into your life, the things that you are non-compromising on in regards to I am going to choose to live my life this way, and I'm not willing to compromise either these habits, routines, values. What are those things now that cause you to be able to write the narrative of your life?
Good question. So when we were in the green, when we were talking about, pillars of health, I call them maintain your domains. And it's these, what are the core things that you need to do to stay on course, right? So that's staying connected to God first and foremost. And I'm not as good at that as I would like to be. So that's what we're talking about is intentionality. So if you just kind of go through life reacting to things, well, then you're rudderless, and anything can push your ship wherever. And ultimately you're going to end up on the reef and sunk. So, for that analogy. And so for me, it's, if I want to become a better man, well, how do I do that? Well, I talk to God about that. I talk to him about my struggles. I go to my men's accountability group every week. I read books by other authors who are smart and know stuff I don't know. And that helps me to challenge myself. And sometimes they say things I really don't like or don't agree with, but I still have to think about it. I go to church every week if at all possible, unless we're out of town. I maintain my physical health. I try to be cognizant of the things that I feed myself. If I'm feeding myself from the constant 24/7 fear news cycle, I'm probably not going to be very optimistic. So I got to be cautious about that. Maintain connection with friends and obviously with my wife and my daughters. Try to be intentional about that. Always room for improvement, but I think it's just maintaining those things, taking care of myself spiritually, emotionally, physically, and relationally, and also doing my job. Getting up and strapping on my shoes and going and saying yes to what God wants me to do in this world.
Is there anything else that you do? And I'm asking this question on purpose because I've talked with a lot of individuals. Is there anything that you do to restore what we would call your internal, whether you want to use the word soul, energy, your internal compass, that part of you that's key, especially when it gets extremely stressful, or especially when you notice yourself. And frankly, I'm projecting here, but because I do this, it's like there's times when I fall back into some of those old habits and those old patterns of thinking. And so how do you bring yourself back out of that? Is there something that you do to be able to recognize that, to shorten that cycle, to say, look, I know I'm thinking in the negative terms, I'm going down that, what do you do to try to bring that back?
Yeah, good question. One of the things that I do as a regular practice is I do a prayer journal. So years ago, my wife and kids got me this nice leather journal from Barnes and Noble, and I'm on my fourth one now. So I just journaled yesterday, and I read through my journal, and I was like, man, I was complaining. I was just the way it's funny. I had this misconception of what it meant to pray when I was younger. And is it the Lord's Prayer, or do you have to do a certain thing in a certain position or whatever? And what I've come to understand that God as Father, God as good counselor, is He wants to have a relationship with me. He wants to have a friendship with me because He loves me like crazy. And that means that even sometimes I'm yelling at Him. And I'll never forget this one time I was mad at myself and mad at my kid, just mad. And I'm in my car and I'm like, rah, 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 yelling at God about stuff. And I actually came up to a stoplight and I hit my steering wheel. And I look up and there's this person in a car in front of me. And I see these big eyes in their mirror looking at me. And I'm kind of like, I'm just going to hide under my steering wheel. And the whole time I'm yelling at God, I felt Him smiling at me. And like, why are you smiling at me? I'm mad at you right now. And He's just like, oh, I love you. I'm like, stop it. So it's, to me, it's when I recognize that I'm going in a wrong direction. I've got to surrender, because I'm as feisty as I am, as strong as I am. The more I try, the more I fail. But when I surrender, God's like, okay, I got this. Go that way, and everything becomes clear. But man, do I fight like crazy before I let go.
I think we all do. So let's walk down that path just for a brief second here. What's that like to do when you surrender? What's that? How do you shift your mind into that? How do you, you know what I'm saying? Like we all, especially as men, we talked earlier, and let me just kind of bring this together. This is where my brain's at. Let's bring this whole thing together with. We talked about the fact that we embrace this warrior aspect as a male, and we want to be able to fight, and we want to be able to save the damsel in distress and have a cause worth fighting for. So that's that one concept that's ingrained in our nature. And now you just introduced the concept of, well, in order for me to get anything done, I have to surrender. Right. How do you marry those two things together, and how do you flesh that out on a regular basis?
Well, it's counterintuitive, because if we listen to our John Wayne mentality, we just got to power through, or the old Monty Python skit, I've cut your leg off, it's just a flesh wound, it's just to tough it out. Well, that doesn't actually work, right? So I think of it two ways. One analogy I use is if you've seen Karate Kid 2.
No.
And if for the younger members of your audience, you should watch it. It's corny, but you should still watch it. That Ralph Macchio's character standing on this piling, a bunch of feet up in the air, and this big thing swings towards him that has a spike on the end. And Mr. Miyagi said, "Oh, well, you've got to put the pad on the end of that spike because it'll kill you." And Ralph's being a typical stubborn male and says, "No." So he does this thing. Instead of trying to stop it, he spins away from it, kind of like a willow tree bends in the wind, and a different type of tree might snap. So he learns he's surrendering to the force, but it also allows him to strike back against the enemy. So the counterintuitive aspect of surrendering is that when you stop punching the brick wall and you surrender, God says, hey, if you walk 3 feet this way, you can walk around it. It's letting go of the lie that I have to figure it out, that I have to know how, I have to be strong enough, and saying, like I think as it Paul is saying, I delight all the more in my trials and tribulations, because it's through that process of surrender that God says, I will take this from you, my yoke is light, and all that great stuff, that He gives you freedom. So it's a feeling of freedom, but sometimes I am intentional about it, and that's when things go really well. And sometimes I got to hit my knees, because I have to. God's like, okay, if you keep going down this path, Mike, I'm going to let you, because you have free will, and I will be there at the end when you fall on your knees in pain and anguish. It'd be easier if you chose to surrender it now, but if you want to keep going down that way, okay.
Yeah, I love that explanation. It is kind of that ability to just adjust when necessary and be adaptable. You got me thinking. I'll be honest with you. You got me thinking about just the whole concept of how these things come together, because I think they are counterintuitive and they feel like they do not belong. Kind of like the symbiotic relationship of how yes, we are strong and yes, we are warriors, but yet at the same time, there is this matter of surrendering and allowing things that are immovable to go around them. So I absolutely love this. As we kind of wind down and as we close out today, what would be one thing, and we can take it one of two different directions. I'll let you decide which direction we want to go. Either what would be the one thing that you would want to say to your younger self, not in how to change things, but just to give comfort? Or what is one thing that you want to leave with the audience that, hey, out of everything that we've talked about, this is the one thing that you really need to walk away with today?
Gosh, if I could talk to my younger self, I would say to him, you're going to be okay. You are loved. You are valuable beyond measure. You're not defined by what was done to you or by the mistakes that you've made. And you've got great stuff coming because you are loved. And you may not understand God or know God or get a thing I'm saying right now, but just hear what I'm saying. You are loved. God made you on purpose. You are absolutely not a mistake. The creator of the universe, who knows time, who is time, so he is past, present, and future. So anything you might ever do, have already done, he already knows. And that's a question that I ask folks in my book about overcoming shame. I say, if the creator of the universe knows everything you're ever going to do and everything you ever might do, if you're so bad, why would he make you? Obviously, it's a rhetorical question because he wouldn't. It's like, he talks about the potter, right? The potter making a pot. If the pot gets messed up, he squishes the clay and he makes a new one. Mm. God doesn't make imperfect things. And the things that we struggle with draw us to him, give us humility, and help us become stronger to overcome those things. So that's again, that counterintuitive thing, Tim, of looking at your imperfections as gifts that help you become stronger and force you to be creative, instead of, I stink because I'm X way. Like, I've got ADHD tendencies. I joke I have CRS, can't remember stuff. That's just helped me become stronger in terms of other things. So I'm really good with sticky notes.
I had never heard that before. That's awesome.
Oh, well, feel free to steal it.
I've never heard that one. Oh, that's good. All right.
Yeah, I got LD and CRS.
Yeah, exactly. Oh, that's hilarious. And probably the older you get, the less it is, or the more it is, I guess, would be the right way. Yeah. It's like, I got sticky notes everywhere, man. It's all.
Where's my list?
Yeah. So, how can people get in touch with you? Where can they find you? I know you said you wrote a book. I'm sure that's probably on Amazon as well. So we'll definitely get links to that. But how can people get in contact with you to reach out and say hi and connect?
Yeah, sure. You can call me directly on my business cell, which is 904-502-1952. You can email me directly at stapletonconsulting@gmail.com. And it's spelled like it sounds, Stapleton, Stapleton, consulting@gmail.com. My website is Stapleton Consulting Services altogether.com. And it talks a little bit about my services on there. There's also some articles and videos on there. So under the articles tab, you can see, my goofy face and what I look like. And yeah, the Shameless book. Now, definitely do a link, because if you go to Amazon and you type in Shameless book, there's like anthologies of pornography that are going to come up, which is kind of ironic. So my book is kind of sandwiched between these things. So I'm like, I'm hoping, well, maybe some people who have trouble with porn are going to see my book and be like, maybe I shouldn't buy these and buy that instead.
Yeah.
So
we'll definitely get a link specifically for that.
Yeah. I'll email that to you when we're done.
Perfect.
So there's a book and a workbook there, and it's based in Scripture, and it's to help people to overcome the lies of shame and claim their identity in Christ. And one other book I would like to mention to you. I don't know if you've ever heard of Matt Halleck.
No.
Yeah, he wrote a book called The DNA of Man. Hold on. Yeah, the DNA of a Man. Matt Halleck, Hallock, and he has a podcast. Fundamental paradigm shift in my thinking when I read his book. Fantastic book. So can't recommend it enough.
Yeah, we'll get that definitely in the notes. Again, thanks for being with us today, Mike. I love this conversation. I love where it's going. Love what you're doing. Just again, thanks. Appreciate you being here.
Thank you. I appreciate you, Tim.
Awesome. All right. So those that are listening again, we say this every time, but I mean this from the bottom of my heart, and I encourage it more than ever. Is the fact of make sure that you reach out to us because we love to hear about what's going on in your lives. We love to hear something that was spoken either directly to me or directly to Mike. Reach out one way or the other. Something that we said, if it resonated with you, if you made a change, if you are instituting something, we want to hear it because that's what gives us the fulfillment and the drive and the ability to be encouraged and keep moving on. So reach out, whether again, directly to Mike or myself. But until next time, keep writing, crafting your story because each story matters and your story is just as important. I'm stuck. I'm going to have to edit the end part out of this because I cannot get this to stop. Why are you
Okay.
not stopping? Stop. What in the world?
Yeah, that was my Wi-Fi last night.
Yeah, I literally cannot. I'm hitting the stop button and it's literally not stopping. It's saying it's still uploading. Stop. I can't get the upload. On your side, does it show how much you're uploading?
It says 99%.
Okay, so that's good.
I don't know if that's just the connection or what that is, but
No, that's the amount that's being uploaded.
oh, okay. Yeah, it was fluctuating a little bit now and then, but it's 99% right now. I was worried I was going to say a ton of ums. I think I did it. I think I did fairly
Oh, you
well
did
today.
fine. It was perfect. Yeah, I just need to mark down when we actually stop so that way I can just tell her ignore everything past I am not sure what to do because I've never run into this situation before where it just will not. I can't even move my screen. Like I can't do anything.
Well, that's not good.
Well, my concern is that it will. Well, I can open up a different screen. Let me open up a different screen and see if I can. Oh, maybe I can't open up a different screen.
Now, when this is edited and published, will you send me a link?
Yeah. So what I'll do is actually do two things. One is I'll send you the link for the actual podcast aspect of it, and then two is I'll send you a link for the Google Drive that will have the snips and the cuts in it, so that way you can use those for posting to other places.
Okay.
So, my computer is completely froze up here. Is it still saying 99% upload on your side?
Yes, sir.
Okay, because I think I'm going to have to hard stop it. Oh, I wonder if I can open up another tab just to see if it's actually uploaded. Oh my goodness gracious. Just like this whole website is frozen. Can you leave? Are you able to leave?
I think so. It's got the hang up button for me.
Yeah, go ahead and hang up, but don't
Okay.
close it out. I'll text you and see if I need to.
Okay.
Maybe that'll do something
All
there.
right. So if that's the end of this, thank you.
Yep, thanks, man.
And we'll connect again. All right. I'm going to hang up now. It says leave studio.
Yep. can't I close this?